I want to thank the chair and the witnesses for a very interesting conversation about policy and American leadership in the Arctic. And I totally understand the national security implications for why we need to have a greater and a safer presence in the Arctic. I'm also hearing a lot of interest in safety and for shipping. It makes perfect sense, but a lot of this has to do with mineral development, fossil fuel development, and other things that raise questions about environmental standards and environmental protection. And I am wondering, before we get too far into the massive costs of all of these things, if anyone is thinking about what American leadership looks like in the Arctic when it comes to protecting the unique natural resources of the Arctic and the ecological values. Is this just a rush to exploit things from the Arctic, or is American leadership also attempting to project our standards and environmental values into this conversation? And I would open that up certainly to any of the witnesses that want to speak to it, because I haven't heard much about that.
Yes, Congressman. The United States, through the Arctic Council, has been a leader in all things related to environmental protection and sustainable development. This Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, which I mentioned in my testimony, is really an overview of and a strategy for how to protect people and the environment. So I think we've been there. I think the State Department, through the Arctic Council, representing us there, and all the agencies, including the Coast Guard and NOAA, at the Arctic Council have been world leaders in environmental protection, marine safety, and this question of infrastructure that relates to all of that.
Anyone else want to add to that? Yeah.
Congressman, I'd also add, I think there's some exciting opportunities. You look at the 5 Arctic coastal states plus 5 major fishery states joining together in placing a moratorium on fishing in the central Arctic, the high seas. That's a preemptive diplomatic effort to make sure the science is there before the fish arrive. Yeah. And so I think that's a good example. We know there's going to be work to look at biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. That's looking at the high seas area, again, to ensure that we have strong biodiversity. The Arctic is front and center at that conversation. We also have, even in the business community, the Arctic Economic Council is very focused on making sure that any investor, any business practices in the Arctic have the highest standards. It takes extraordinary stewardship to make sure that any economic activity is done at the highest level. But this is something that we do have practice with, but we have to ensure it. So I think there's actually some very good news on that front, marine protected areas, but it does require continued vigilance. All right.
I appreciate that very much. I want to, if I can, ask specifically about black carbon. And Mr. Kennedy, I know that the United States is trying to make some progress. The International Maritime Organization, it's my understanding, is moving fairly slowly on addressing emissions pollution, particularly black carbon. Current targets by the Arctic Council nations to reduce black carbon emissions, many people believe need to be strengthened, and we need a more active U.S. role in leading that change. So I would like to ask you if you think it's true that the Arctic is particularly sensitive to black carbon from maritime emissions and the implications of that.
It's certainly true that black carbon is a contributing factor. And NOAA is not a leader in the discussion about black carbon. I can say what I just said because I've been in many conferences and sessions where EPA, for the most part, has led the discussion about black carbon and what needs to be done about it.
That's not very reassuring right now, but please continue.
I can't claim to be an expert, but yes, indeed, it is an issue. Everybody from the Arctic Council to science ministerials have been discussing it, and it has been a little bit of a slog.
And would you agree that without adequate international regulations that address these maritime emissions, rising Arctic maritime transportation because of this will actually accelerate the already alarming trends we see in the Arctic?
I don't think I can be the one to make that statement, but I think logically, if you have additional activities going on there, carbon is going to be an issue, and it's an issue.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Garrett.